What if the force that has been controlling most lives was never outside of us at all? Not a monster, not fate, not bad luck, not some external darkness choosing who rises and who remains stuck. What if the real prison was built quietly, thought by thought, fear by fear, habit by habit, until it became so familiar that it started to feel like personality? So normal that people stopped questioning it. So invisible that they began defending the very patterns that were draining their power. Most people believe they are making conscious choices. They believe they are thinking for themselves. But are they? Or are they simply reacting to internal programming they never chose, repeating emotional patterns that were planted long before they knew how to protect their own mind? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the greatest form of control does not arrive with noise. It arrives through repetition, through doubt, through emotional exhaustion, through the slow acceptance of fear as if fear were wisdom. And once fear is accepted, it starts shaping perception. It tells a person what is possible, what is dangerous, what is realistic, what is too much, what is not for someone like you. Over time, that voice begins to sound like truth. But it is not truth. It is conditioning. There is a reason so many people feel trapped while appearing functional. There is a reason they work, speak, dream, and even love from a place that does not feel fully alive. They are not failing because they are weak. They are failing because they have been mentally occupied. And the moment you see how that occupation begins, you also begin to see how it ends. But where did this invisible control system come from, and why was it hidden for so long? In 1938, a man who had spent decades studying success, interviewing some of the most powerful and wealthy individuals of his time, wrote a manuscript so unsettling that it was locked away for over 70 years. This was not because it lacked value, but because it revealed something most people were not ready to confront: the true mechanics behind human behavior, failure, and unconscious control. Instead of presenting his discoveries in a traditional format, he chose a symbolic approach. He imagined a direct conversation with what he called the devil, not as a religious figure, but as a representation of the forces that quietly dominate the human mind. Through this fictional dialogue, something extraordinary happened. The patterns most people ignore were suddenly exposed with brutal clarity. The devil in this narrative does not threaten. It does not force. It does not attack. It simply influences. It waits. It observes. And most importantly, it takes advantage of something that already exists within the human psyche: the tendency to drift, to avoid discomfort, to surrender clarity in exchange for emotional safety. What makes this idea so powerful is not the metaphor itself, but what it reveals about reality. Control does not require force when it can operate through suggestion, through fear, through repetition, through subtle emotional conditioning that slowly shapes identity. And here is the uncomfortable truth. If this system has been operating for so long, how much of what you believe about yourself was actually chosen by you? Or has your identity been quietly constructed by patterns you never questioned? If that question makes you pause, then you are already beginning to wake up. If this is opening your mind, subscribe to the channel and like the video. There is much more that most people will never see. What happens when someone who has spent years studying success suddenly realizes they are no longer in control of their own mind? Before uncovering these patterns, he was not just an observer of human behavior. He was living proof that belief could reshape reality. Coming from poverty, loss, and uncertainty, everything changed because of a single shift in perspective. Someone close to him planted a different idea in his mind, an empowering belief strong enough to override fear. And from that moment, his life began to reorganize itself around possibility instead of limitation. For over 2 decades, he immersed himself in the study of success. He analyzed not just what successful people did, but how they thought, how they perceived challenges, how they responded emotionally to uncertainty. He spoke to hundreds of millionaires, thousands of individuals, searching for patterns that could explain why some people rise while others remain stuck. And then everything collapsed. The Great Depression did not just take away material stability, it dismantled his internal certainty. The same mind that once operated from clarity began to drift into doubt. Fear slowly replaced direction. Indecision began to interfere with action. And something subtle, yet powerful, took over. A state where he was no longer consciously choosing his path, but reacting to circumstances. This is where the real discovery begins. Because it revealed something most people never realize. No amount of knowledge protects you if your internal state shifts. Intelligence is not immunity. Experience is not protection. The moment fear takes the lead, even the most disciplined mind can begin to fragment. And that raises a deeper question. If someone who understood success so deeply could fall into this state, how many people are living there without even noticing? And more importantly, how do you recognize when it's happening to you? What if every decision you make is quietly being influenced by just 2 invisible forces, and you were never taught how to recognize them? At the core of human behavior, there is a constant internal tension. Not dramatic, not obvious, but always present. On one side, there is fear, the force that contracts, that hesitates, that calculates risk until movement feels dangerous. On the other side, there is faith, not blind belief, but a state of expansion, where action becomes possible even without certainty. Every choice you make is shaped by which of these forces is leading in that moment. When fear dominates, perception narrows. Opportunities begin to look like threats. Time feels scarce. The mind searches for reasons to delay, to avoid, to protect. And it does this so convincingly that it feels rational, logical, responsible. But underneath that logic, something else is happening. Your creative capacity is being suppressed. When faith leads, something entirely different unfolds. The same situation is interpreted through possibility. The unknown is no longer a threat, but a space where something new can emerge. Action becomes lighter, faster, more intuitive. Not because risk disappears, but because your relationship with uncertainty changes. This is where most people lose control without realizing it. They believe they are making decisions based on facts, when in reality, they are reacting to emotional states. And those emotional states are often conditioned, repeated, and reinforced over time until they become automatic. So the real question is not, what should I do? The real question is, who is deciding right now, fear or faith? Because once you begin to see this clearly, you start to understand something powerful. Your life is not shaped by circumstances, but by the force you allow to interpret those circumstances. And that realization changes everything. What if the greatest enemy you've been trying to fight was never outside of you to begin with? For most of our lives, we are taught to look outward when something goes wrong. We blame circumstances, people, timing, lack of opportunity. We search for explanations in the external world because it feels more comfortable to believe that something beyond our control is responsible. But what if that perspective is precisely what keeps the cycle alive? The devil, in this model, is not a being. It is not a presence that visits you. It does not arrive with intention or identity. It exists as a pattern within the mind, a structure made of repeated thoughts, reinforced emotions, and automatic reactions. And because it is internal, it does not need to force anything. It simply operates through what is already familiar. It enters through negativity, through doubt that feels reasonable, through hesitation that appears intelligent, through emotional weakness that disguises itself as caution. And over time, these elements begin to organize themselves into something more powerful, a predictable mental pattern. Once that pattern is established, it begins to run automatically. You start overthinking before acting. You start questioning yourself before trying. You start imagining failure before giving yourself a real chance. And the most dangerous part is that none of this feels imposed. It feels like you. This is the illusion. Because when a pattern becomes identity, it becomes invisible. You stop observing it and start defending it. You call it being realistic. You call it knowing your limits. You call it protecting yourself. But what if those limits were never real to begin with? And if they were created, can they also be dismantled? Because the moment you stop fighting the outside world and start observing the internal pattern, you begin to take your power back. What if control over your life doesn't happen through force, but through repetition so subtle you never question it? There are two primary mechanisms that quietly shape human behavior more than anything else. Not intelligence, not opportunity, not even environment. Two forces that operate beneath awareness, influencing choices, reactions, and ultimately destiny. The first is habit. Habits are not just actions. They are neurological shortcuts. Repeated thoughts become emotional responses. Repeated emotions become behavioral patterns. And repeated behaviors solidify into identity. The brain is designed to automate whatever is repeated because automation conserves energy. But this efficiency comes with a cost. Once a pattern is automated, it is no longer questioned. You don't consciously decide to doubt yourself every time you face something new. You don't choose to hesitate before taking action. You don't intentionally replay worst-case scenarios in your mind. These responses feel immediate, natural, almost instinctive. But they're not instinct. They are rehearsed patterns. The second mechanism is even more dangerous because it hides behind normality. It is what can be called mental drift, a state where the mind is no longer directing life, but simply reacting to it. Days pass without intentional thought. Decisions are made based on mood, pressure, or convenience. There is movement but no direction, activity but no clarity. And because this state is socially accepted, almost expected, it rarely raises concern. This is how control becomes invisible, not through dramatic events, but through the gradual surrender of awareness. And once these two forces, habit and drift, work together, something powerful happens. Your life begins to repeat itself, not because you lack potential, but because your patterns are running on autopilot. So the question becomes unavoidable. If your current results are being produced by unconscious repetition, what would happen if you became fully aware of the pattern? What if the moment you lost control of your life was not dramatic, but almost imperceptible? Control rarely disappears all at once. It doesn't collapse in a single decision or a single failure. It begins in something much smaller. A thought you repeat without questioning. A hesitation you justify. A fear you accept as normal. And because these moments seem insignificant, they pass unnoticed. At first, it's just a delay. I'll do it later. Then it becomes a pattern. Maybe this isn't the right time. And eventually it becomes identity. This is just how I am. This is how control begins. Through micro decisions that slowly shape behavior, and behavior that slowly shapes self-perception. Each repeated thought strengthens a neural pathway. Each emotional reaction reinforces a familiar response. And over time, these patterns begin to organize into something that feels stable, but is actually restrictive. From a deeper perspective, this is not just psychological, it is energetic. Every repeated thought carries a frequency. Every emotional pattern stabilizes that frequency. And once stabilized, it begins to attract similar experiences, reinforcing the same internal state. This is why people often feel like they're living the same scenarios in different forms. The details change, but the emotional pattern remains. Fear plays a critical role here. It is the entry point, not because fear is inherently negative, but because when it is left unobserved, it becomes a filter. It begins to interpret reality for you. It tells you what to avoid, what to expect, what to believe about yourself. And the more it repeats, the more it solidifies. Until one day, you are no longer choosing your responses. You are predicting them. And once your reactions become predictable, your life becomes predictable too. So the real shift does not begin with changing your actions. It begins with noticing the first thought that tries to define them. What if the fears you think are protecting you are actually the exact mechanisms keeping you confined? Fear does not always appear as panic or anxiety. In fact, the most powerful fears are often the quiet ones, the ones that feel reasonable, justified, even intelligent. They don't shout. They whisper. And because they whisper, they are rarely questioned. There are 6 fundamental fears that shape most human behavior, whether consciously recognized or not. They operate like hidden filters, influencing perception, decisions, and self-worth. The fear of poverty silently limits creativity. It pushes people to choose security over expansion, survival over possibility. It convinces them that risk is dangerous, even when growth depends on it. The fear of criticism suppresses expression. It makes people edit themselves before they even speak. It teaches them to seek approval instead of truth, to fit in rather than stand out. The fear of illness embeds itself in the body. The mind begins to anticipate weakness, and over time, that anticipation can influence physical reality in ways most people underestimate. The fear of losing love creates dependency. It leads to self-betrayal, where people adjust their identity just to maintain connection, slowly disconnecting from themselves. The fear of aging traps individuals in comparison. It shifts focus away from growth and toward loss, creating resistance to change instead of alignment with it. And the fear of death, perhaps the most subtle of all, limits presence. It pulls attention away from the moment, creating hesitation where there could be full engagement with life. These fears are not random. They are deeply embedded patterns, often introduced early, reinforced socially, and repeated unconsciously. But here is the critical realization. Fear only has power when it is unseen. The moment you can name it, observe it, and question it, it begins to lose its authority. So the question is no longer, how do I eliminate fear? The question becomes, what is this fear trying to make me believe about myself? What if the thoughts you believe are yours were actually installed long before you had the awareness to question them? In the earliest stages of life, the mind is not analytical. It does not filter. It does not challenge. It absorbs. Everything, words, emotions, reactions, expectations, is received as truth. And because there is no resistance, these impressions sink deep into the subconscious, forming the foundation of identity. This is where the most powerful programming begins. A child does not choose beliefs about money, love, success, or self-worth. These ideas are inherited through parents, through school systems, through cultural narratives, through repeated emotional experiences. If fear is present in the environment, fear becomes familiar. If limitation is normalized, limitation becomes expected. Over time, these early impressions evolve into internal rules. Be careful. Don't take risks. You have to struggle. People like us don't succeed like that. These are not just thoughts. They are instructions. And the subconscious mind does not question instructions. It executes them. From a deeper perspective, this is where reality begins to form. Because the subconscious is not concerned with logic, it is concerned with consistency. It will align perception, behavior, and even opportunity with whatever has been repeatedly accepted as true. This is why two people can face the same situation and experience completely different outcomes. It is not the situation that defines the result, it is the internal programming interpreting it. And here is where the realization becomes uncomfortable. If most of your beliefs were installed before you had the ability to choose them, how many of your current limitations are actually inherited patterns? Not chosen, not verified, just accepted. But if they were learned, they can also be unlearned. And that possibility opens the door to something most people never fully explore. The ability to consciously rewrite the foundation of who you believe you are. What if the most powerful form of control is the one that feels completely normal? There is a state so common, so socially accepted, that it rarely raises suspicion. People wake up, follow routines, respond to demands, react to situations, and go to sleep, repeating the cycle day after day. From the outside, everything appears functional, productive even, but internally, something essential is missing. Awareness. This state is what can be called mental drift. It is not chaos. It is not breakdown. It is far more subtle. It is the absence of intentional direction, a condition where the mind is no longer actively choosing, but passively responding. Thoughts arise, but they are not examined. Emotions surface, but they are not understood. Decisions are made, but they are not aligned with any deeper purpose. And because this state feels ordinary, it becomes invisible. People believe they are living consciously simply because they are busy. But activity is not the same as awareness. Movement is not the same as direction. You can be constantly doing and still be completely disconnected from why you are doing it. This is where control becomes most effective. Because when a person is in drift, they do not question patterns. They follow them. They adapt to circumstances instead of shaping them. They seek comfort over clarity. And slowly, without realizing it, they surrender authorship over their own life. From a co-creation perspective, this state is critical. Because reality does not respond to intention alone. It responds to dominant patterns of thought and emotion. And when those patterns are unconscious, creation becomes automatic, not deliberate, not directed, just repetitive. This is why many people feel like life is happening to them instead of through them. So the real question is not whether you are active. It is whether you are present inside your own decisions. Because the moment presence returns, drift begins to dissolve. What does it really mean to be controlled? And how would you recognize it if it felt like your normal personality? An alienated mind does not look broken. It looks adapted. It looks like someone who has learned to function within limitations so well that they no longer question them. From the outside, everything seems stable. But internally, there is a quiet disconnection from purpose, clarity, and self-direction. An alienated person does not necessarily lack intelligence. In fact, many are highly capable, but their thinking is not independent. It is influenced, shaped, and often dictated by external validation, social expectations, and emotional conditioning. They wait for approval before acting. They hesitate when certainty is not guaranteed. They doubt themselves even when opportunity is present. And slowly, this creates a pattern. Decisions become reactive instead of intentional. Confidence becomes conditional instead of stable. Action becomes inconsistent instead of aligned. Over time, something deeper is lost: authorship. Because when you are no longer thinking for yourself, you are no longer directing your life. You are adjusting to it. This is where the illusion becomes powerful, because it does not feel like control. It feels like caution. It feels like responsibility. It feels like being realistic. But beneath that surface, there is a lack of internal authority, a dependence on circumstances to define what is possible. From an energetic perspective, this creates fragmentation. Your thoughts want one thing, your emotions signal another, your actions follow something else entirely. And when these layers are not aligned, your results become inconsistent. Not because you lack potential, but because your internal system is not coherent. So the question becomes uncomfortable, but necessary. Are you truly choosing your path? Or are you adapting to patterns that were chosen for you long ago? What if the patterns you consider just the way you are actually symptoms of a deeper disconnection you were never taught to see? Alienation does not announce itself. It reveals itself through subtle behaviors that most people normalize. Small inconsistencies that, over time, form a predictable pattern. And because these patterns are shared by so many, they rarely feel like warning signs. It often begins with low self-trust, a constant need to double-check decisions, a quiet voice that questions your own judgment. You hesitate, not because you lack ability, but because you have been conditioned to doubt your internal signals. Then comes dependence on external validation. You measure your worth through reactions, likes, opinions, approval. You adjust your expression to be accepted, slowly disconnecting from what you genuinely think or feel. There is also a decline in initiative. Ideas appear, but they are not acted upon. Imagination is present, but it is not trusted. There is a subtle belief that effort may not be worth it, so action becomes inconsistent. Financial patterns begin to reflect the same structure. Impulsive decisions, cycles of gain and loss, a lack of long-term direction. Not because of lack of intelligence, but because internal clarity is missing. Emotionally, there is instability. Reactivity replaces observation. External events easily shift your internal state. A single situation can dictate your mood, your energy, even your sense of identity in that moment. And perhaps most revealing, strong opinions without deep understanding. Beliefs are adopted, repeated, defended, but rarely examined. This is how alienation sustains itself, through patterns that feel personal, but are actually inherited and reinforced. And the most important realization is this: if these patterns were learned, they are not permanent. But before they can change, they must first be seen, not judged, not resisted, simply recognized for what they are. What if the most dangerous trap is not the one that holds you, but the one you don't even realize you're inside? Because the true power of alienation is not in its intensity, it is in its invisibility. There is a loop that quietly sustains itself in the background of many lives. It begins with fear, often subtle, almost rational, a hesitation, a doubt, a sense that maybe now is not the right time, that something is missing, that you are not fully ready. That fear leads to inaction. Not dramatic avoidance, but small delays. Postponed decisions. Opportunities left unexplored. Words unsaid. Moves not taken. And in that space of inaction, something begins to grow. Lack of direction. Without action, clarity fades. Without movement, purpose becomes abstract. The mind begins to search for certainty before taking the next step, but certainty never comes without movement. So the cycle continues. And as direction weakens, alienation deepens. Because now it is no longer just about fear. It becomes identity. I'm not the kind of person who does that. That's not for me. Maybe in another moment, the pattern reinforces itself until it feels permanent. This is the loop. Fear, inaction, lack of purpose, deeper alienation, more fear. And what makes this loop so powerful is that it feels normal. People don't see it as a trap. They see it as life. From a co-creation perspective, this loop stabilizes a specific frequency, one of hesitation, uncertainty, and contraction. And reality responds accordingly, reflecting the same patterns back in different forms. So life begins to repeat. Different scenarios, same emotional experience. And the question becomes unavoidable. If your current reality is a reflection of this loop, what would happen if you interrupted it at its origin? What if the real cost of staying in this loop is far greater than you have ever measured? Because alienation does not just delay results, it slowly erodes the very forces that create them. At first, the loss is subtle. A missed opportunity here, a delayed decision there. Nothing that seems irreversible. But over time, something deeper begins to weaken. Initiative fades. The natural impulse to act, to explore, to try, begins to disappear. Ideas no longer carry urgency. Inspiration loses momentum before it becomes action. What once felt possible starts to feel distant. Then comes the loss of self-determination. Instead of directing your life, you begin negotiating with it. You wait for better conditions. You adjust to circumstances. You respond instead of initiating. And slowly, without realizing it, you surrender control over your own trajectory. From an energetic perspective, this is critical. Because initiative is movement. It is forward energy. It is what signals to reality that you are participating in creation. When that movement weakens, the flow of opportunities also weakens. Not because they disappear, but because your internal state is no longer aligned to perceive or act on them. And as self-determination declines, something even more important is affected: connection. You become disconnected from expansion, from growth, from the natural intelligence that guides you toward aligned opportunities, ideas, and people. Life begins to feel heavier, more effortful, less responsive. This is why many people feel stuck without understanding why. It is not a lack of potential. It is a gradual disconnection from the internal forces that activate that potential. So the real question is not, why isn't life working? The real question is, what part of me stopped moving and when? What if the protection you've been searching for is not external, but something you can build within your own mind? If alienation is the state that leaves the mind vulnerable, then there must be a condition that does the opposite, a state that stabilizes clarity, protects against fear, and restores direction. And there is. It is called a definite purpose, not a vague desire, not a temporary motivation, but a clear, defined intention that organizes your thoughts, emotions, and actions around a central direction. Purpose is not just about what you want. It is about what you are committed to creating, regardless of external conditions. When purpose is present, something powerful happens internally. The mind stops drifting, because now Every decision has a reference point. Every action can be measured against something meaningful. Distractions lose strength because they no longer align. Fear still appears, but it no longer dominates because there is something stronger guiding your movement. From a neurological perspective, purpose creates coherence. Your brain begins to filter information differently. It prioritizes what is relevant. It reduces noise. It strengthens focus. This is not effort, it is alignment. From a co-creation perspective, purpose stabilizes frequency. Instead of shifting emotionally with every circumstance, your internal state begins to hold a consistent direction. And consistency is what allows reality to respond. Not occasional intention, but sustained alignment. This is why purpose acts as a form of protection. It does not eliminate challenges. It does not remove uncertainty, but it prevents fragmentation. It keeps your internal system organized even when the external world is unpredictable. And without it, the mind becomes open to influence. So the question becomes essential. If purpose is what protects your mind from drift, fear, and external control, why do so many people avoid defining it clearly? Why do so many people spend years searching for clarity, yet avoid making the one decision that would create it? Because defining a clear purpose is not just an intellectual act, it is a psychological commitment. And commitment demands something most people unconsciously resist: responsibility. As long as purpose remains undefined, there is room for excuses. There is space to delay, to reconsider, to remain in possibility without confronting reality. But the moment you define a clear direction, something shifts. Now there is a standard, a path, a structure that requires consistency. And this is where fear reappears, subtly, intelligently. What if I choose the wrong path? What if I fail? What if I can't sustain it? These questions feel logical, but they often serve as protection mechanisms against discomfort. Because once a purpose is defined, inaction is no longer neutral, it becomes visible. It can no longer hide behind uncertainty. From a deeper perspective, this hesitation is not about the future. It is about identity. A clear purpose challenges the current self-image. It asks you to become someone more consistent, more disciplined, more aligned. And the existing identity, built over years of patterns, resists that change. Not because it is right, but because it is familiar. This is why so many people remain in reactive living. They respond to circumstances instead of creating direction. They stay busy, but not intentional. They move, but without alignment. And because there is no defined purpose, there is no internal structure to stabilize their actions. From a co-creation standpoint, this creates scattered energy. Intentions are inconsistent. Emotions fluctuate. Actions lack coherence. And reality reflects that fragmentation. So the question is no longer, how do I find my purpose? The real question is, what part of me is avoiding the responsibility that comes with defining it? What if the difference between a life that drifts and a life that expands comes down to how clearly a person decides what they are here to create? A purpose-driven individual does not move randomly. There is structure behind their actions, even when the path is uncertain. They are not waiting for perfect conditions. They are engaged mentally, emotionally, and energetically in something that gives direction to their choices. This does not mean they never feel doubt. It means doubt does not decide for them. There is a central objective, clear enough to guide, flexible enough to evolve. Around it, smaller goals begin to organize themselves naturally. Each action connects to something larger. Each step reinforces movement. And over time, momentum builds, not from force, but from alignment. You can recognize the state in how a person speaks. There is clarity, not arrogance, but conviction. Their words are not scattered or reactive. They reflect direction. They reflect intention. Even uncertainty is expressed with awareness, not confusion. They think independently, not because they reject external input, but because they do not depend on it to define their path. They can observe, learn, and adapt without losing their internal reference point. And most importantly, they take responsibility, not in a heavy or burdensome way, but in a grounded, empowered sense. They understand that their results are connected to their internal state, their choices, and their consistency. They do not wait to be pushed. They initiate. From a co-creation perspective, this creates coherence. Beliefs align with direction. Emotions support action. Actions reinforce identity. And when these layers align, reality begins to respond differently. Opportunities appear more clearly. Decisions become faster. Progress becomes visible. So the real question is not whether you have potential. It is whether your life is organized around a direction strong enough to activate it. What if your purpose is not only a direction, but a shield that protects your mind from manipulation, distraction, and fear? When purpose becomes clear and consistently reinforced, it begins to function as more than motivation. It becomes structure, a mental framework that filters what deserves your attention and what does not. And in a world filled with noise, opinions, trends, pressures, distractions, this filtering mechanism is everything. Without purpose, the mind is open to suggestion, open to fear-based narratives, open to comparison, doubt, and external influence. It absorbs whatever is repeated the most. But with purpose, something changes. Your attention becomes selective. You no longer react to everything. You evaluate. You choose. You decide what aligns and what is not. Distractions lose their emotional pull because they are no longer relevant to your direction. From a neurological perspective, this is precision. The brain begins to prioritize information that supports your objective. It strengthens focus, reduces cognitive overload, and enhances decision-making speed. You are not thinking more. You are thinking more clearly. From an energetic perspective, purpose stabilizes your frequency. Instead of fluctuating based on external circumstances, your internal state begins to hold consistency. And consistency is what creates influence. Not intensity, not temporary motivation, but sustained alignment over time. This is why purpose acts as protection. It prevents your energy from being scattered. It reduces the impact of fear because fear no longer defines your decisions. It is simply observed and navigated. It limits manipulation because your direction is internally defined, not externally imposed. And when this state is fully embodied, you become difficult to control. Not because you resist the world, but because you are no longer dependent on it to define you. So the question becomes powerful. If purpose is what protects your mind, what would change in your life if you treated it as something non-negotiable? What if discovering your purpose is not about searching outward, but about removing the noise that has been covering it all along? Most people approach purpose as if it were something hidden in the future, waiting to be found. They search for signs, for certainty, for a moment of absolute clarity. But what if purpose does not appear through searching, but through uncovering? Because beneath the layers of conditioning, fear, and inherited beliefs, there is already a direction. Not always fully formed, not always logical, but present. It shows itself in subtle ways. in what naturally draws your attention, in what you feel compelled to explore, in what gives you energy instead of draining it. The first step is self-observation, not judgment, not analysis, just awareness. What do you think about when no one is influencing you? What ideas return repeatedly, even when you try to ignore them? What feels meaningful beyond external validation? These signals are not random. They are indicators of alignment. The second step is commitment, not to perfection, but to movement. Once a direction begins to emerge, it must be acted upon, even if it feels incomplete. Clarity does not come before action. It comes through action. Each step refines the path. Each decision sharpens the direction. The third step is recognition of your natural patterns. What comes easily to you? What do others consistently notice in you? What feels intuitive, almost automatic, when you engage with it? These are not coincidences. They are expressions of your internal design. From a co-creation perspective, purpose is not something you invent. It is something you align with. And the moment you begin aligning through awareness, commitment, and recognition, something shifts. Because now, you are no longer waiting to discover your path. You are actively revealing it. What if the belief that you have no special talent is not a truth, but one of the most effective illusions ever created? Because talent is rarely absent. It is often unrecognized, underestimated, or dismissed before it has the chance to develop. Not because it lacks value, but because it does not match a predefined standard of what talent is supposed to look like. From early on, people are taught to compare, to measure themselves against others, to define ability based on external validation, to believe that if something is not immediately exceptional, it is not worth pursuing. And this is where many natural abilities are quietly abandoned. But talent does not always appear as something dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle, a way of thinking that connects ideas differently, an ability to perceive patterns others overlook, a sensitivity to emotion, communication, or timing, a natural inclination toward structure, creativity, or problem-solving. These are not random traits. They are expressions of internal architecture. From a deeper perspective, these patterns are linked to behavioral archetypes, repeated ways of perceiving, reacting, and creating. And these archetypes shape not only what you are good at, but how you engage with reality itself. When these patterns are ignored, something important happens. Energy becomes misaligned. You force yourself into roles that do not resonate. You pursue paths that feel heavy instead of natural. And over time, this creates frustration, not because you lack ability, but because your internal design is not being expressed. From a co-creation standpoint, alignment with your natural tendencies amplifies results. Because when action flows with your internal structure, it requires less resistance and generates more momentum. So, the question shifts again. What if your talent has never been missing, only misunderstood, overlooked, or never fully trusted? What if your behavior is not random, but a reflection of deeper patterns that have been shaping your life from the background all along? Every person operates through internal frameworks, repeated ways of thinking, feeling, and responding to the world. These are not accidental. They form over time through experience, conditioning, and perception. And once established, they begin to guide behavior automatically. These patterns can be understood as archetypal structures, not in a mystical sense, but as consistent behavioral signatures. Ways your mind organizes reality. Ways you interpret challenges, relationships, risk, and opportunity. Some people naturally move toward creation, others toward analysis, some toward connection. others toward control or stability. None of these patterns are wrong, but when they remain unconscious, they limit possibility, because you begin to operate within a narrow range of responses. You react the same way to different situations. You repeat the same decisions in different contexts. And over time, your life begins to mirror those patterns with precision. This is why self-awareness becomes essential. Not to judge who you are, but to understand how you function. When you begin to observe your patterns, your tendencies, your emotional triggers, your decision-making style, you gain something powerful, the ability to interrupt automatic behavior. And in that interruption, there is choice. From a co-creation perspective, this is where transformation begins. Because reality does not respond only to what you want, it responds to how you consistently operate. Your patterns create your frequency, and your frequency shapes your results. So, when you become aware of your internal structure, you are no longer limited by it. You can refine it, expand it, redirect it, and that is where identity begins to shift. Not by force, but by conscious design. So the question becomes clear. If your patterns have been shaping your life until now, what would happen if you started shaping them instead? What if the moment your life begins to change is not when something external shifts, but when you finally decide to think for yourself? Most people are not lacking opportunities. They are not lacking intelligence. They are not even lacking potential. What they are lacking is awareness of the patterns that have been silently directing their lives and the willingness to step outside of them. Because the truth is simple, but not easy to accept. The majority are not consciously creating their reality. They are repeating it, repeating inherited beliefs, repeating emotional reactions, repeating decisions that feel familiar, even when they lead to the same outcomes. And as long as this repetition continues, results remain predictable. But something extraordinary happens the moment awareness becomes active. You begin to question thoughts that once felt automatic. You observe fears instead of obeying them. You recognize patterns instead of identifying with them. And in that space of observation, control begins to dissolve. Because control requires unconsciousness. It depends on you reacting without noticing, believing without questioning, repeating without awareness. The moment you interrupt that cycle, something shifts at the core of your identity. You are no longer drifting. You are directing. And this is where everything integrates. When you think independently, you reclaim authorship. When you define a clear purpose, you create structure. When you act with intention, you activate alignment. From a co-creation perspective, this is the turning point. Because now, your internal state is no longer fragmented. It becomes coherent. And when coherence is sustained, reality begins to respond in ways that once felt impossible. Not because the world changed, but because you did. And once that shift happens, there is no returning to unconscious living. Only forward with awareness. If this shifted the way you see your own mind, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Like the video and share it with someone who needs to break free from unconscious patterns. Your next level begins with awareness. Don't keep it to yourself.